So tonight our guest speaker, who will be ghostly in this video, is going to speak to us about Depth Psychology and a New Ethic by Erich Neumann. Now, Neumann was one of the early followers of Dr. Jung. He was Jewish. He left Europe in 1934 and went to Palestine and lived in Tel Aviv for the rest of his life. And during World War II, he was entirely cut off from the Jungian community. And during that 5-year period, he wrote the origins and history of consciousness, and he wrote this book, Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. And so tonight our member John is going to talk to us about this. He's going to remain ghostly on the video to maintain anonymity, but I hope you can hear him. I've got him in a position where his voice should come across.
We want the whole restaurant together.
All right, go for it. Speak.
Okay.
Speak loudly. I meant to say speak loudly.
Yes, this book was published in 1947.
Right.
So Neumann was in Israel, and I believe and this became a very controversial book because it. I believe they were, according to this letter that you gave me, they were trying to set up the Institute in Switzerland, and it has sensitive overtones of religion.
So they were setting up the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, and they knew that Dr. Jung's work related to religion would be very sensitive, and so. Anyway, Dr. Neumann came out of Tel Aviv with these two terrific, amazing books, which I highly recommend to you, The Origin and History of Consciousness and the New Ethic, Depth Psychology and the New Ethic. And he ran into a little bit of trouble from the Valkyries, who were the women who were buzzing around Dr. Jung at that time and who were busy setting. The Valkyries is a tongue-in-cheek way of referring to the very professional and very committed 4 or 5 women who were close enough to Dr. Jung to want to set up the Institute in Zurich. So we'll say it that way to be serious. They were very committed, very professional. One of them was a Jew who had gone back to Austria in the mid-30s because Dr. Jung said to her that he would not teach her to be a Jungian analyst until she came with a PhD. So she went back to Austria during the Nazi period. She posed as a Catholic for 5 years to get her PhD, and then she came back and founded the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich in 1948, 10 years later. But that's how committed she was, so it's quite a story. But anyway, Dr. Neumann's story is also equally powerful.
Okay, so the book starts out with setting up what the problem is, and the problem, he states, is evil, so that's his premise. He's starting with the problem of evil.
So he's starting with the problem of evil.
And he said that it's not the fight against evil itself that plagues modern man. That's the bitter truth of our experience, but at best the fight against annihilation by evil, which incites modern man to take action. So instead of going at the source of it, evil, the evil itself, man was just trying to fight against the possibility of annihilation. So it was a fear-driven thing, rather than trying to get to the heart of the matter. And he said that in the modern age, conscious mind is able to deal with physical nature and master it, but not man's psychic nature.
Man's what nature?
Psychic nature.
Okay, so humans weren't trying to get to the base of psychic nature.
Right. We had mastered, mankind had mastered material nature, but not the psychological aspect.
Right.
And he talks about the collective outbreak of evil in the 20th century, the two world wars, the bloodletting of the two world wars. So the theme of the book is how man has tried to manage evil based on the old ethic. And so he defines the old ethic. The old ethic is dualistic, meaning it polarizes good and evil among all the other opposites, but primarily he's talking about evil here, so good and evil. And the history of civilization shows that this split happened in Iranian, Judeo-Christian, and Gnostic forms. Okay, so it wasn't particularly characteristic of Eastern religions.
So everybody saw this as a problem. They were all trying to deal with it. Okay, great.
So the old ethic of dividing existence into two forms, good and evil, works. He says it works as long as the collective possesses values that they can agree upon. Values that are codifiable and transmittable in a universal manner.
So if everybody believes in the same religion, then it works. But if people start to fall away from the religion, then you got a problem.
Yes, he talks about it as a crisis of values. And the individual then lacks a collective orientation and falls sick. Because there's no longer a collective answer to the tribulations of life. So he talks about two basic principles that have made possible the implementation of the old ethic. So in order for the old ethic to hold up, human beings have to use one of two tools, suppression or repression. And suppression is where, correct me if I'm wrong here, Skip, but suppression is where one uses asceticism and discipline to put the values out of the conscious mind.
They use fear. This is a sin. This is a what do they call the sin? I mean, the Catholics are into what is it? I didn't mean to offend Catholics, by the way, but Catholics call it a mortal sin, right? So suppression was all about mortal sins, right? I mean, at least
there were a whole classification of sins, but the idea was that you could focus on what Neumann calls the anti-value, which is the value that is against the collective value. And you can suppress that, but in order to suppress it, you have to feel guilt, and you have to feel suffering, and you have to basically be miserable.
And you have to feel fear.
That feeling. Yeah. So you're constantly living in this. You're living in this life of asceticism, where you're denying yourself everything, but you're also feeling the suffering of it. So there's no way out. It's like being in a box. And the other form is repression. And repression is what we've talked about often in the group, which is making the instinctual opposition to a value that's in the collective, making that unconscious, or unwittingly burying it in the unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And so
maybe it's like internalizing the suppression.
I think so. It's a good way to put it. Yeah, because I think they're kind of linked or related in some
Surely, yeah.
So he says, what constitutes a value for one society, period, or community may represent an anti-value to another, and collective agreement with the collective values in force at any given time is in fact impossible. So I have a picture here of the Kaepernick people. The football players who are taking a knee at the games, they have one set of values that are in opposition to a lot of the values of the people in the stands, and it creates.
I'm sorry. That's an example of an anti-value.
Yes.
Value is just
It's a value, but it's opposing the mainstream value.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it creates this huge friction. He talks about, on page 39, he talks about the role of the revolutionary. They're the founders of new religious or ethical movements, and they choose their inner voice over the values of the collective. And he actually calls them criminals.
He calls them criminals because
criminals.
Boy, we're right in that one, right in the middle of that one.
They're going straight up against the values of the collective.
Right.
Which
I think we're.
Maybe we need a private meeting.
I think we're good as long as the kids keep talking.
And dropping things.
So we go to the.
Sub rosa.
He then talks about the shadow and the persona. And the shadow is the repressed content in the psyche, and the persona is the mask. Or the outer manifestation of self-control, the acceptable facade behind which the dark and strange side of our nature remains invisible. So we've talked about
Right. So in other words, in the United States, the persona of being a conservative film producer has been ripped aside in the case of Harvey Weinstein. Right?
I suppose so. Yeah.
That was the revealing of his dark side. Yeah.
Well, it's the same thing Jung talks about, where in England the petty bourgeois businessman goes about his business during the day, but he's repressed his instincts, and then at night he wears a uniform and goes to like a cult, like
Cult rallies. Masonic
ritual
event
or
or KKK or
right,
right, or the huh?
Not Templars. Masons, you said.
Well,
Just a Jungian discussion group.
yeah, we're just a Jungian discussion group. We're definitely on the dark side. We're definitely on the dark side.
We have cookies here.
Pardon?
We have cookies here.
Yes, we have cookies.
I love that. I have that up in my office. So the shadow he defines as the expression of our own imperfection and earthiness, the negative which is incompatible with the absolute values of the collective. And it can also appear as the opposite capacity of spirit, for instance, when the conscious mind only recognizes the material values of this life. Ego inflation. So I'm defining terms that he's using here, but he's bringing them all.
Wait a minute, you're going too fast here. Okay, so because I can't even keep up with you, and I speak English. All right, so the shadow can also appear in the opposite capacity as spirit, for instance, when the conscious mind only recognizes the material values of life. And I think we've talked about in this group pretty extensively that materialism is a false road. You can put the Maserati in your driveway, and that can be your goal for 20 years. But the problem is, once you've got it in your driveway, it still needs oil changes, and it still only takes you wherever you want to go at 65 miles an hour, most of the time in the U.S., max. And it's pretty, but what good is it? Does it attract girls? Are you married? It's an issue. I mean, isn't it? I mean, I went through this. I bought a red Corvette, and
Did it help?
no, because I immediately put it in my garage for 18 months and didn't admit to anybody that I had it.
You were embarrassed?
Yeah, somewhat.
Was your shadow?
Yeah, it was my shadow in a way. And, also, I didn't want to admit to my staff that I was taking enough money out of the company to buy a Corvette, right?
There will be judgment, yes.
Yes, there will be judgment. However, the word got out, I think. The word got out because I had my CIO and a couple of other people over at the house one time, and I said, well, I'm going to let you drive I'm going to let you have an experience with my secret thing. And he says,
I might have left right then.
yeah, he says, survey says Skip has a Corvette. So it was my shadow. Yes, it definitely was. Surely it was. And, I drove it. I played, what's the song from Simon and Garfunkel that starts with the bongo drums and
Cecilia?
Mrs. Robinson.
no, it's the first thing I remember. Me and Julio down at the schoolyard, right? So I have a recording of that, and I would get in my Corvette, turn the sound up really loud, and drive down the road playing me and Julio down at the schoolyard, right?
That's fine. Because I would play Mrs. Robinson in my little Spitfire.
Uh-huh. But
Simon and Garfunkel was the music of the shadow.
It was, yes.
yeah,
But
but
it wasn't my shadow.
well, that definitely was my
Was
shadow.
driving it.
That definitely was my shadow because I was doing the opposite of that in the 60s when I was going in the Marines and everybody
Spitfire's
else.
not quite as glamorous as a Corvette.
Right. But what I found out is, okay, I had this Corvette for 5 years and I drove it 20,000 miles in that 5 years. And pardon?
That's not much.
That's not much, right? And it didn't make me any happier, not a bit. And so finally I said, really, I'm having I'm getting older. I'm having a hard time getting down into this thing. I think I'll sell it.
You know, because when I get one of those rental cars, I'm so used to an SUV,
Right.
or a minivan, you know,
Right.
which I like.
So that's an example of ego inflation.
Yeah, I guess. I mean,
Puffed up.
or
The expectation that it didn't sound like it did it though.
no, it didn't do it.
You weren't.
No, it was definitely shadow, though. Okay, but carry on. So we've talked about shadow and absolute values. and-
Okay. So he's talking about ego inflation. I'm just following the course of the book. He talks about ego inflation in quite depth, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but basically, the ego inflation is what causes the individual to forget his shadow. And that's his creaturely limitation in corporeality.
Right.
His bodily.
It's called the setup.
Yeah.
That's where the shadow's going to strike.
Yeah, the shadow gets ready to strike. I mean,
So he does talk about the energy level that builds up as a result of this ego inflation. It causes the charging of with energy that is greater than consciousness, and it causes a kind of state of possession of the conscious mind.
yes, it does, no doubt. I'm going to put this PowerPoint on on the video so that you can follow along. But here's the classic example of ego inflation, which is Icarus flying too close to the sun. And we do have modern day Icaruses.
So in the dualistic system, to review, we're contrasting a world of light and darkness, pure and impure, good and evil, God and the devil. And it manifests, this is very important, it manifests in variations such as man should be noble, helpful, and good, devout, believing, brave, efficient, dedicated, and sensible.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, it sounds like the Boy Scout motto, Boy Scout oath, right? Okay,
The do-gooder.
they do good. Yeah.
So, and then the methods to enforce this system are suppression
Repression and suppression.
of the negative component.
Right.
So this causes, the next page, it causes the psychology of the split. So the split, the average man will tend toward ego inflation. And the moral elite, who are the ones doing the suppressing, are basically the cultural dictators who come in with their voice, and they tend toward ego deflation.
So why is it redacted?
His is in blue. He was kidding earlier about being redacted.
I just messing it up.
Average man will tend toward ego inflation. Moral elite will tend toward ego deflation. Yeah, except I mean, like now, the moral elite has no standing anymore.
Depends on where you live.
Yeah, I suppose. Depraved individual has the consciousness of sin. Okay.
So apparently the depraved individual doesn't have ego inflation or deflation, he's just depraved. I mean, that's all I can take from what he said there.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, and
Consciousness. So he's aware. So that, I mean, that would be what a criminal.
Yeah.
He accepts himself as.
and he has no voice and no value system at all. It's just he's pure animal instinct. And I have talked to someone recently who's a therapist who has run into people like this, and he said that, you know, that these are the psychopaths. He said they're the only ones that he really was afraid of in talking with them,
Why?
because of this
No
just
limits.
complete animal-like nature, I guess.
Yeah.
No elevation above that level.
Yeah.
Well, even the
I-
animals are afraid of a bigger animal.
Even the animals are afraid of a psychopath. Yeah.